that I really feel like Malin, in the United States anyway, started a whole new branch of neurology. He started this branch of, began thinking, what could I contribute to this evolving concept? And it occurred to me, since cortical recording by electrocorticography was such a standard technique in neurosurgery, and there existed temporary Ecog strips to do this, that it would be a contribution I could make to expand that level of thinking about oscillatory synchronization to another site in the network. So we needed another technique that had some kind of real-time, that is intraoperative, high spatial resolution method to know we're in the right spot. So that's what got, me and my colleagues interested in at some of the recordings on STEM. And we found, for example, a patient who had a huge 40 hertz sharp peak in the power spectrum, and thought, well, that's on STEM, that's obviously an artifact, right? It just looked like it. So then, years later, I had the opportunity to record the same thing in the patient after he'd been switched to a Percept pulse generator. And you could just, out of interest's sake, I looked at it as you had STEM on, then you turned STEM on, and that huge 40 hertz artifact.
Welcome to Stimulating Brains.
Phil Starr is a professor of neurological surgery at University of California, San Francisco, and a developer of implantable brain devices. I've been a long-time admirer of Phil's work, and in this conversation we blaze through quite a few of his numerous publications. One key breakthrough and invention of Phil's work has been to include Ecog recordings, both intraoperatively but also chronically, to investigate brain signals in various states. We talk about the Open Mind Consortium, mentorship, and the cross-pollination between academia and industry. One key recent highlight of Phil's work is a paper which was accepted for publication in Nature Medicine at the time of recording just yesterday. In it, the three co-first authors, Carina Oehrn, Cernera and Lauren Hammer, demonstrate the chronic use of a newly identified cortical physiomarker, which is now referred to as the finely tuned gamma activity. I would like to use the opportunity to also thank Julian Neumann and John Ralston for submitting guest questions to the podcast episode. And I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. And thank you for tuning into Stimulating Brains. So, Phil, thank you so much for taking part in this. I'm really honored to be able to talk to you also that long. And so it's really an honor to have you on the show. And as you know, typically to break the ice before we get into science, I always ask about your free time. So what do you do when not in the OR or not involved in science?
Yes, well, I've always loved outdoor sports. I love skiing, snowboarding, scuba diving, overnight backpacking. And since I have a 15-year-old boy now, he has been my partner in these activities for a number of years. And that is my main source of enjoyment and stress relief as well.
That's fantastic. Really cool. Yeah, going outdoors, and especially with family, that sounds very lovely. Moving to your career as a neurosurgeon, but also neuroscientist, who were key mentors, and also what were the main maybe turning points to get where you are now?
Sure. I really want to talk a little bit about Malin DeLong, who you know well, our whole field knows well. He's been on this podcast, and as we all know, he recently passed away a few weeks ago. So there's been many thoughts and reminiscences about him. So him and his group were so influential in my career. When I finished my neurosurgical residency and was just thinking about what I wanted to do, I found kind of at the last minute the opportunity to go down and be a fellow in movement disorders surgery in the team led by Malin DeLong with other important folks, Jerry Vitek, who's now chair of neurology at Minnesota, Thomas Wickman, a wonderful prominent researcher still at Emory, Roy Bakay, who unfortunately passed away a few years ago. That was the team, and it was just an incredible time at Emory University. It absolutely launched my career. was very enjoyable. And I was also impressed that it was a fellowship, even though I was a neurosurgeon and recently just finished my training in neurosurgery. It was a fellowship organized really through the Department of Neurology. And it illustrates something I really loved about Malin, that he was one of the first neurologists to stop recognizing the distinction, the artificial distinction between neurology and neurosurgery. And, everyone knows the contribution he made of the great 1990 paper in Science, which is a foundational paper in our field, right, about lesions in the subthalamic nucleus and how they can improve Parkinsonism, influence Benabide and starting STN, DBS, et cetera. But I think some of his other contributions are a little bit more intangible. One is that I really feel like Malin, in the United States anyway, started a whole new branch of neurology. He started this branch of interventional neurology in movement disorders, neurologists who are deeply involved in neurosurgery, in guiding it, thinking about it deeply, improving it. I don't really think that existed before Malin, and a number of prominent people that we all know have followed in that career pathway. So that's a big thing that I attribute to him. And he was just also a really kind and open person. I've often found this is true of Aline Benabide also, who I had the good fortune to visit in 1996 when I was just getting going in this area. And these leaders of the field have just been so friendly and open, have welcomed so many visitors, and I think it shows a characteristic of people at the top of their game, right? That they do tend to be very open and kind people.
How long did you stay in Grenoble?
Well, Grenoble was just a very brief visit. I was not a fellow there. I literally was just recommended to me, hey, this guy, Benabide, is doing some very interesting new work. Again, was just at the end of my neurosurgical training. And so, I went for, a couple of days to see, I think Fantastic. It was the 13th subthalamic stem there. But yes.
And do I remember correctly? Oh, the 13th. So it was really early days. Because you did kindly give a presentation in our talk series that we also have in the Stimulating Brain website. And if I remember correctly, your then chair also wanted you to go to Grenoble and wanted you to essentially go into the DBS field. Do I remember that correctly?
Not exactly. The person who actually told me about Benabide and what he was doing was a professor in Lausanne, Switzerland, Nicolas de Triballet. And I was, as an elective in residency, before I really got focused on functional neurosurgery, he knew Benabide, relatively close in various neurosurgical societies, said, hey, as long as you're here, you should go see Benabide and see his work. So that was Fantastic. The first. My chair here at UCSF, Mitch Berger, another very influential person. He's the person who gave me a job right out of fellowship, and I've been here ever since. He did recruit me to set up a DBS program here. Okay. My fellowship was mainly learning microelectrode-guided techniques for pallidotomy. This was in that beginning of the second wave of movement disorders surgery in the U.S. anyway, emphasizing palatal lesioning. And the DeLong team, along with some other groups like at Toronto, were really understanding how to do this right, where to put the lesion, how to do the recording, and that was the foundation. But at that point, again, under Benabide's influence, DBS was just coming to the U.S. a little bit later than it started in Europe under him, and that resulted in my recruitment out here. So if it hadn't been my connection to Emory, to Malin, to the neurosurgery department there under Dan Barrow, that's I would not have my position at UCSF.
Fantastic. And then I think, if I remember correctly, you also mentioned another inspiration was Irving Cooper and the book The Vital Probe. My true first exposure to movement disorders surgery happened by chance when I was 19. I was browsing our college bookstore, and I saw his autobiography called The Vital Probe, My Life as a Brain Surgeon. And I liked reading biography, and something about it struck me, so grabbed it. And I've recently reread it also. I think it's been reprinted. It was hard to find for a while. I really recommend that to people in our field. Have you read it, by the way, Andy? I have not. No, I should.
It's worth it. It's a great personal insights into the first phase of movement disorder surgery in the 50s and 60s, before levodopa, before CT scanning, and MRI revolutionized neurosurgery. So you can learn a lot about the field and also learn about those severe barriers between neurology and neurosurgery that existed then and exist much less now.
Fantastic. So other turning points or people that maybe can also ask what first brought you into functional then, so into the pallidotomies? Was it the exposure in MRE, or when did you decide that?
Well, it was at the end of my residency, which is at Brigham and Women's Hospital, a place that you know well. I liked image-guided surgeries. I just had a certain attraction to those. There was very little functional neurosurgery there. But because I liked image-guided things, and I also had done research in physiology, I was oriented there. I had a chance in elective time at the end of my residency to work a little bit with Reese Cosgrove across town. He was then at Mass General, actually. Great. Now at Brigham, but he was at Mass General. I had a chance to just scrub in on some cases. He was very kind about that. Got to meet Ann Young, who was working with him to build their pallidotomy program in the mid 90s. So that was a big influence on me as well. Yeah.
Really cool. And then I think in the talk you also mentioned much later, I think, but was Peter Brown that kind of, or his work was inspirational?
Yes. So after I had, originally when I came in 1998 to UCSF, my mandate was to start clinical programs at both the university and in the Veterans Administration system to start really the first, availability of movement disorder surgery in the VA hospital. So I was very busy doing both of those, and really did not have much time to launch an independent research career in those first years. But I started reading in the 2000s the work of Peter Brown, and what intrigued me a lot about it was how much information he was able to extract from this tiny little signal, right? A lot of his papers were on the local field potential in the subthalamic nucleus, some in the pallidum and elsewhere, and applying enormous analytical depth and thoughtfulness to that little, 5 microvolt signal, really tiny, could tell so much. And of course, it launched, maybe along with other people, but he was a main person to launch this whole theory that oscillatory synchronization is important in the pathophysiology of movement disorders and in mechanisms of therapy, of levodopa and of DBS. So that intrigued me, and I began thinking, what could I contribute to this evolving concept? And it occurred to me, since cortical recording by electrocorticography was such a standard technique in neurosurgery, and there existed temporary Ecog strips to do this, that it would be a contribution I could make to expand that level of thinking about oscillatory synchronization to another site in the network, primary motor area, which of course figures big even in the rate model, right? Earlier models before the oscillatory synchronization framework, motor cortex features prominently. And so I think that was a big inspiration to start the subdural electrocorticography work. There were other influences on that. Robert Knight, a scientist at Berkeley, had done a lot of work paired with some of our UCSF faculty in cortical recording. He was the person who really looked at phase amplitude interactions there in prefrontal cortex more than motor cortex. And that was another window using Ecog on cortical function that I thought could prove fruitful. So that was another intellectual influence. There were others. I was reading some of the early work of Pascal Fries on the communication through coherence hypothesis. Yeah. That was another intellectual influence. Well, maybe if we do multi-site recording, we can really leverage that hypothesis to gain insights about movement disorders.
Super interesting. So we had actually a guest question by John Ralston who asked exactly what inspired you to start with Ecog recordings, but you just answered that. So I just wanted to mention that would have been his key question. Before we go into the Ecog and more signal processing things, I wanted to briefly, remember one anecdote of myself where I was standing with Reese Cosgrove much later than that in the Amigo suite at the Brigham. I was still a postdoc at the Beth Israel, so now we have colleagues in the same hospital. But back then he was kind enough to show me the Amigo suite, which is this intraoperative MRI suite. And he had open a free ebook that's called iMRI DBS by Paul Larson, Alastair Martin, and also yourself. So I think you also pioneered beyond the EFIS world to some degree this intraoperative MRI guidance. Can you talk a bit briefly about that and maybe also how you see it now?
Yeah. This was a super fun project that began early in my career, and that again was one of the most fun things about it. It was a very close teamwork between myself, Paul Larson, who really put together that wonderful ebook, and Alastair Martin, an MR physicist who was critical to our work, and the motivation, at least for me, to start the interventional MRI is we were starting to do more DBS in children for dystonia. My first was in 1999. Philippe Koobs was publishing a lot about that in the late 90s, early 2000s. And the awake microelectrode guided procedure that I had learned as a fellow at Emory, was not really appropriate for kids. Can be done, but is tough. So we needed another technique that had some kind of real time, that is intraoperative, high spatial resolution method to know we're in the right spot. So that's what got me and my colleagues interested in a sort of a form of a sleep DBS, if you will, but guided not with physiology but with real time MR. And then, of course, I found, as many who've done exclusively awake surgeries, there's a population of adults for whom getting through awake surgery is very tough. Anxiety, severe in Parkinson's, severe off-period pain, in dystonia, severe, neck postures that make it difficult to do these things awake. So it was needed. It was needed something new, and that's how we got started with it. And we were fortunate, after originally working with the NextFrame device from Medtronic, to pair up with a company called ClearPoint to develop their so-called SmartFrame. And Paul Larson has continued to do quite a bit of development of that, more than myself, Paul and Alastair. And I think, just to summarize what's nice about that technique, of course, it offers an option for a sleep DBS that's accurate. It's conceptually very simple. There's no stereotactic registration step of one space to another. You're all working within the XYZ of the MRI bore, right? That appears right on the MRI console. You can do imaging at any point to guide the procedure. It's quite accurate in that if you pick a point on the MR, a patient's MR that you get right at the beginning of the surgery, you say, I want to go to that point. This method of sort of a certain marriage of imaging techniques and the device, skull-mounted aiming device that has 4 degrees of freedom, this sort of integrated system can deliver your probe or your drug or your cell or whatever to the picked point on the MR really more accurately than a stereotactic frame can. It's the average accuracy, or this what we call the radial error, the difference between where you wanted to go and where you ended up in an axial plane, sort of orthogonal to the trajectory. That average difference, last we measured, is around 0.6 millimeters. And for a stereotactic frame doing the same thing, picking a point, dropping a probe, asking how close you did, it's generally not quite as good as that. So the conceptual simplicity, the accuracy, are very attractive, and there exists a population of patients for whom it is more appropriate than awake surgery, with the compelling features.
Do you currently do exclusive asleep or a mix of the two?
I do a mix. I do still slightly more surgeries in the regular operating room awake, but don't hesitate to have people do the interventional MRI. All my pediatric cases, we don't discuss it. They just go right to the interventional MRI, and we have a really great suite at our children's hospital that can do that. I am a bit envious of the Brigham. They had an interventional MRI suite, really developed since a long time ago for that purpose. We redesigned our iMRI suite at our Parnassus campus and opened in January. So we now have a dedicated suite, a couple decades after Amigo.
Fantastic. Really cool. So another guest question by Julian Neumann, which also is about Ecog, but a bit more about the machine learning capabilities. So he asks, the use of Ecog to study cortex-basal ganglia interactions was a huge inspiration for me, for Julian. What inspired you to pioneer this? And I think that Ecog has a lot of utility for machine learning-powered adaptive DBS and clinical BCIs, so brain-computer interfaces in general. Do you think having an additional Ecog paddle could become standard in, say, 10 years from now?
Yeah, well, thanks, Julian, for that question. We already, of course, talked about the inspiration and the intellectual influences on getting that started. I'm very interested in cortical physiology and movement disorders. We have not proven that you must have or you need this extra, electrocorticography strip to do, say, adaptive stimulation. We have not proven that. I think what we've shown so far is that it's very useful. You can find useful signals for decoding the patient's motor state, of course, as Julian and others have done for just decoding movement and maybe movement speed, if you want to use that for adaptive stim. It's a great signal. It's bigger than the STN signal because it's a layered structure, right? So the synaptic potentials add up in a layered structure in a way they don't in a deep structure like the subthalamic nucleus. So the answer to Julian is I hope that it does become more standard, but I certainly don't want to claim that it is needed. And we've gotten some appropriate pushback on the cortical recording method from very serious investigators who think, let's go. It's so much simpler to use the same depth lead as you need to put in for stimulation. Let's use that also for recording. That may be the answer. We've been working a lot, as you know, on adaptive stim, and we just had a manuscript on that accepted yesterday, finally, after a lot of work.
Congratulations.
And thank you. It's a manuscript based on our preprint of adaptive stim. It had 3 first authors on it, Carina Oehrn, Cernera, and Lauren Hammer. It's on medRxiv, and now will be coming out as a real publication. But there we had 4 patients, actually 6 hemispheres in chronic adaptive stimulation at home, and looked at, we first did a naive search through frequency space in both the subthalamic lead and the cortical lead, and asked what are the best signals for decoding movement state, and use those for adaptive stim. And in 4 of the hemispheres, the cortex was the better one, but 2 hemispheres, the subthalamic, actually had the best signal, although in both of those, the cortical signal was pretty good too. Mm-hmm. So from that limited series of 6 hemispheres, all of them could have been driven in cortically driven adaptive stim, but 2 of them could be done well with the subthalamic signal, and we're done with the subthalamic signal. So that's where we are now on the cortical technique. And I appreciate so much Julian is, extending this as Mark Richardson and others are extending this, in all sorts of new fascinating directions, and will help to establish it as a great tool.
Yeah, I was still in Berlin when we got the IRB approval to do Ecog strips there, and we were all super excited that following your footsteps there as well. So I think it's a fantastic concept, and there's so much that we can do. And we'll go into the new paper soon. I, of course, want to talk about that one too, but maybe earlier work with Coralie Hemptin, who's very successful now in Florida, but trained with you, showed that DBS plays a role in kind of decoupling the phase amplitude coupling between cortical activity and the beta rhythm in the subthalamic nucleus. I hope I said that right, but how do you interpret these findings looking back? This is from, I think, 2015? Around?
Yeah. And papers in 2013, 2015 that Cora did. The main finding is that DBS that this form of cross-frequency interaction, the tendency of broadband activity to line up with a particular phase of the beta rhythm, that is exaggerated in the Parkinsonian state in the cortex and can be disrupted by DBS. This is a finding that is easier to study with acute intraoperative recordings. It benefits from a high sampling rate. So it's been tougher to study with the chronic recording that we've done more recently. It's been replicated by a few labs, and certainly the idea that cross-frequency interactions might be important in Parkinson's was first in a paper by, I think it was Allegre, in Journal of Neuroscience around 2010 or so. So that was there, and then we started working on that in the cortex. It's a difficult signal to use for adaptive stim because it's highly non-stationary. Really, these bursts of increased phase amplitude interactions come and go in a non-stationary way. And of course, no implanted device can really use cross-frequency interactions. There's also, as you know, varying biophysical interpretations of the phenomenon of the cross-frequency interaction. So, our original thought was that the broadband cortical gamma activity that is thought to be a surrogate for population spiking, that activity in the cortex was excessively synchronized to the phase of the motor beta rhythm. There's other interpretations that, in fact, the synchronization occurs at the level of thalamocortical inputs, which tends to make beta waves sharper, which results in this phase amplitude interaction. So I think the biophysical interpretation is still evolving, although the finding has been replicated, and we replicated with EEG as well. Some of Nikki Swan's work was to pursue that finding in EEG, but it hasn't been as practical as other signals to pursue for adaptive stimulation.
Makes sense. And a very intuitive interpretation, running the risk to oversimplify. Is there something that there is some sort of hyper over-synchronization that we can maybe block with DBS, where this might lead to too much stopping signal or too much, in that way, bradykinetic and rigid state? Do you have some words around that, or is that too simplistic?
No,
to think
it's not. I mean, the idea was that Brown's work and others had shown that this STN beta rhythm is suppressed by DBS. So what's happening at the cortex? And first we thought, well, maybe the cortical beta rhythm itself is suppressed by DBS. Yeah. Looked at that, and Cora showed that actually, to a first approximation, the beta rhythm is not strongly affected by DBS itself. So what are some of the second order elements of beta synchronization that could be examined that might be affected? So, in that communication through coherence hypothesis, right, from Pascal Fries, the idea is that the oscillatory rhythm organizes population spiking, right? And you can transiently synchronize activity in multiple neuronal elements organized through a rhythm, like the beta rhythm. So the idea was that, in an untreated state, the cortical neurons that normally need to come in and out independently of synchronization to achieve a movement, those are excessively firing in lockstep with the beta rhythm and aren't adequately released from the beta rhythm in a normal task-dependent way, and that perhaps DBS is releasing these cortical populations from this excessive influence of the beta rhythm without just simplistically suppressing the beta amplitude itself.
Makes sense.
Doing this decoupling. So that's kind of the conceptual model.
Fantastic. Cool. Another one of your many fantastic papers that you put out was spearheaded by Whitney Chen in 2020, published in Neuron, and you looked at evoked potentials of the hyperdirect pathway. So that is single pulses of DBS in the subcortex, and then you would record up there with Ecog strips in different parts of the cortex. And I think this builds on work by Svetlana Miocinovich, which earlier also in your lab showed that there is a hyperdirect projection, from the motor cortex. But I think in the neuron paper, you also could show that it's there's one from the right inferior frontal cortex to the STN. So maybe in more general terms, how do you conceptualize these hyperdirect inputs to the nucleus from the cortex? It seemed to be, widely projecting, maybe entire frontal cortex sparsely, but yeah.
Well, first, I give a lot of credit to Svetlana, who really spearheaded that original recording method. And it's not easy because to detect that hyperdirect pathway with Ecog, you're stimulating in the STN and you're looking for backfiring into the cortex at a very short latency. It's non-synaptic, right? You're backfiring the axons that innervate, the hyperdirect axons innervating the subthalamic nucleus. So you're detecting something at a latency of 2 or 3 milliseconds from the stim artifact, and it has some challenges to detect. And Svetlana did a great job in this paper she spearheaded of teasing that out, and then Whitney's work built on that. And you've worked on hyperdirect inputs as well from prefrontal cortex and that great OCD work that you've done, Andy. The non-human primate work had indicated that, from the whole frontal lobe, there's projections, hyperdirect projections in the STN. I will say that when Whitney started looking at prefrontal cortex, there was sort of a hot spot of a higher retrograde evoked potential in that inferior frontal gyrus, which people like Adam Oehrn at UCSD and others had hypothesized was important for a stopping signal. And we did find the IFG to be a bit of a hot spot for this evoked potential. On the other hand, I was very intrigued that the hyperdirect input from other areas, like in your OCD connectomics paper, right, that there is other hyperdirect inputs from prefrontal cortex that are important in DBS effects in pathophysiology. So I think of it as anywhere in the frontal cortex can have a hyperdirect input.
I mean, I can relate to the hotspot. There's often the IFG often pops up also in the fMRI maps that to be seem to be more connected to the STN for whatever reason. Since it was right IFG, we probably both assume it's also the same on the left. And do you think there could be speech and language issues, or if we stimulate that connection, could that have something to do with, verbal fluency? Any thoughts on that end?
Yeah, it's underexplored. Whitney did show that the left IFG also had a bit of a hot spot of that hyperdirect, retrograde evoked potential. It's there on the left as well as the right, even though she studied the right much more. And so that's an underexplored area.
Yeah. Sounds good. And this study, I think, is a great example of how DBS can not only be a clinical tool, but also a window into the brain. Do you have currently maybe other examples where you've delved more in the neuroscience of things using this technique, or current ongoing work that you're excited about, or how do you see that?
We've moved, I'd say my immediate lab has moved in the last 5-6 years much more into chronic brain recording as we've had good tools to do that, and we're experiencing some of the profound limitations of the intraoperative environment, the time pressure, the unnatural state of it. So right now I don't have as much going on with intraoperative work, but my colleagues do. My colleague Doris Wong, who should be on your program too, she's been doing both intraoperative and chronic recording studies of gait decoding in humans with Parkinson's and movement disorders, and is doing some intraoperative task-related work. So we have that continuing. And then occasionally we will get these sort of one-off cases where we are putting in, say, subthalamic leads in a patient who already has palatal leads. And there's a lot of interesting things you can ask about the interaction that you can do intraoperatively with high sampling rates, right? Because one of the advantages of intraop is you can use high sampling rates, more than is available in chronic recording. So yeah, and then Simon Little, we're really fortunate to have Simon Little join us at UCSF, and he and I have intersecting projects, but he has some of his own, I have some of my own, and Simon is doing a lot of work on prefrontal cortex motivation, apathy. So yeah, it's
really
expanding.
nice. Very cool. So you mentioned Doris, and I think I think I have asked her already about the podcast, but I certainly will if I haven't. And we've been in contact with some other things as well. She's fantastic, and I wanted to actually move to one of her projects with you next, which is I conceptualize high frequency DBS to act as an informational lesion, mainly as a first approximation. I know it does also other things, but as a first approximation, it really acts as a lesion, even though it might activate neurons. And I always tell people, even if that were true, that doesn't mean that anything that DBS does will lead to, less activity. It can have a lesion can have very opposite effects, of course, in other areas of the brain. Of course, you can lesion something that inhibits things. And so people, sometimes I feel, tend to forget that. And one work you did was exactly in that domain where you looked at cortical recordings when you did pallidotomies, and you could see that a new physiomarker was all of a sudden came about after the lesion occurred. Can you talk about that study a bit?
Yeah, that's a paper. This was actually Cora and Doris were co-first authors on that paper in movement disorders. And that's one of my favorite papers from our group. It doesn't get talked about too much. But yeah, it was a study where, Cora and Doris did like Ecog recording, the intraoperative subdural electrocorticography over motor cortex during a pallidotomy lesion. And we still do occasional pallidotomies in people who aren't good candidates for DBS. And had this really interesting finding that during the palatal lesioning, you could see, you do the lesioning stepwise, right? You do one lesion, and then you pause and examine the patient, and then you move the probe, you do another lesion. And during the stepwise lesioning process, as we call it, unleashed narrowband gamma rhythms in motor cortex. It's the same that are induced by levodopa. And it's just another indication to me that there's got to be something important about these cortical gamma rhythms, because all the effective therapies, levodopa, palatal lesioning, DBS, all do something to this cortical gamma rhythm. And interestingly, I know you want to talk a little more about the relation of this to dyskinesia, but Malin DeLong, I remember at Emory, he would always point out during palatal lesioning, and of course we're doing hundreds of these then, that there was often a little burst of dyskinesia right when you did the lesion, even though palatal lesioning ultimately is protective long-term against levodopa-induced dyskinesia. And he always took that as a really good sign. Oh, look, there's a foot wiggle there. We're in the right spot. And so it was really interesting to see that, yes, during this acute lesioning, you can unleash this gamma rhythm, and maybe you unleash it a little bit excessively, right? It's not just prokinetic, but pro-hyperkinetic and producing dyskinesia. So I really liked that it correlated with something Malin had talked about a lot in doing pallidotomy.
Interesting. Yeah, I have this anecdote that Reese Cosgrove once told me that he had one case that he did together with Leitinen here in Boston. So Laurie Leitinen, and I think at that time Reese wasn't that experienced yet. Of course, now he's very experienced, but back then he had done only 6 cases or so. And apparently that same thing happened where they made a lesion. There was a lot of dyskinesia, and Reese was rather afraid what had happened. And then Laurie Leitinen said, "He will do great." So apparently, this was the same thing. So it seems like a good thing if it's an acute effect. Yes. Very interesting. So but that gamma induction that you described there, is that the same, and that we can use that as a segue to the finely tuned gamma story? And maybe before we compare the two findings, we might want to talk about that. You already briefly mentioned it. It was a preprint accepted since yesterday. 3 first authors, Stephanie Cernera, you got to help me,
Lauren Hammer, and Carina Oehrn.
Carina Oehrn, exactly. They've presented the work already at the think tank. I think it's fantastic stuff that we just had the OptoDBS conference again in Geneva that you were part of two years ago, and I think Andrea Kuhn has already replicated this as well and showed some data there. So So it seems like a really nice physiomarker that is different to beta, rather a positive thing, or if at all a dyskinesia thing, right? So we stimulate and then it occurs. But maybe you want to summarize the findings a bit.
Yeah, so our first kind of work on the narrowband gamma. So this is different, of course. We have to make the distinction between narrowband gamma, which is an actual peak in the power spectrum of the field potential. It's an actual oscillation. It must be distinguished from broadband activity or broadband gamma, which was more a topic that we talked about a few minutes ago with phase amplitude coupling, right? So the phase amplitude interaction does not involve narrowband gamma, it involves broadband gamma to beta. So the narrowband gamma is something different, needs to be distinguished, and not always is distinguished in literature. But this, of course, was described, in some of Peter Brown's early work. Patients on levodopa, the STN, would show this reduction in beta, but then an induction with levodopa of a narrowband oscillation somewhere between 60 and 90 hertz. So our work on this, really began with chronic brain recording tools because we've never really studied the on-medication state until we had chronic recording. And our first work on that was Nikki Swan's, where she was looking at recording from Activa PC+S, the first generation chronic recording device from Medtronic that was investigational. And she just began noticing in these chronic recordings in the power spectra, these narrowband gamma peaks, and then made the very, very interesting observation. And you always ask about eureka moments, and we don't have very many of them in our careers, but this was one where Nikki showed that that when you activate DBS, it can shift that natural frequency of narrowband gamma, typically 60 to 90 hertz, and shift it to a subharmonic of stim frequency. And as you mentioned, Andrea's group has now been working on this, and some of the Chris Beast papers have looked at that too. So then that was our earliest work. We did collaborate with some of the computational folks at Oxford, along with Tim Dennison and J.J. Sermon and Raphael Bogatz and others who've done a lot of modeling on the entrainment phenomenon of gamma. And it turns out this is a fascinating and complicated story, but you really need to distinguish between gamma band phenomena, narrowband gamma, prior to starting stimulation versus after stimulation. So if you, say, have patients with implanted brain recording devices and look at them during their on-off fluctuations at home, before you start therapeutic stimulation, you can show that levodopa induces a cortical gamma rhythm as well as a subthalamic one, and that it scales with dyskinesia risk, say. And so some of Nikki's early work suggested that, and then one of our grad students, Maria Olaru, has just published a paper in Brain on that in a larger series of patients with the second generation recording device. So prior to stim, narrowband gamma, it's a prokinetic rhythm. It's induced by levodopa. It scales with dyskinesia severity. But then when you bring in stimulation, very interesting things happen. The stimulation does entrain the rhythm, that is, it shifts its frequency to a subharmonic of stim, and it changes its properties in various ways we don't fully understand, but we think it becomes less pro-dyskinetic when you entrain it, and still figuring that out. And I believe that the Berlin group is going to agree with us on that, but not completely sure yet. So that brings up a very general thing I would like to point out from our work, and this is also advice to anyone working in the field, which is always one of your topics, that when we started working on adaptive stim, we thought, great, there's all this beautiful work on biomarkers. There's the beta rhythm. There's, both the basal ganglia, now the cortical gamma rhythm. These are all markers of movement state. We know a lot about these. Let's just plug them into a control algorithm and run adaptive stim, and it won't be that hard. It turned out to be much harder than we thought, doing home adaptive stim. And a reason, it seems obvious in retrospect, introducing stimulation profoundly changes the whole landscape of physiomarkers and movement disorders. we didn't appreciate that enough. So when you introduce stimulation, it changes brain rhythms in a way that you really have to reinvestigate your what are the neural signatures of movement state, because they're so changed by DBS, and that took us a while to appreciate.
I'm sure. I mean, it always seems like, currently it feels like half the world is looking into this, with Percept now being so available, right? That almost everybody that wants to can do it to some degree. And in the discussions, I'm not really part of that field myself, but in the discussions, for example, at the think tank, it always feels like there are these moving targets, right? And we've been at this for 10 years and haven't really solved it in a way. I think some parts have been solved, and we certainly made progress. But one big issue in the beta rhythm is that if you stimulate it, kind of goes away, right? Or if your rigidity goes away, then beta goes away. So it is then probably hard to know when to stop again. So when I heard, as naively from the outside, more an imaging person, about the finely tuned gamma, I thought, okay, now there might be just two bands where you can, stimulate when there's beta, but stop stimulating when there's finely tuned gamma. But I'm sure it's not as simple as you just said, right? Things change, and
we wish it were so simple. I do think that using beta and gamma is going to be fruitful, right?
Yeah.
In the paper that was just accepted with Carina Oehrn, Lauren Hammer, and Stephanie Cernera, the main physiomarker that was used for adaptive stim changes was actually stimulation in trained gamma, which is, again, has to be distinguished from levodopa-induced gamma. And once entrained, the narrowband gamma activity becomes really an on-med state biomarker, more than just, oops, there's dyskinesia, you better lower stim.
Yeah.
But what it does say is if you have this stim-entrained gamma activity, it says your brain, the Parkinsonian brain, is effectively in an on-med state. There's levodopa acting in the striatum, dopamine acting in the striatum, and you can afford less stimulation. So it's a signal to turn down stim.
Okay.
But the nice thing about the entrained gamma, it doesn't go away right away as you lower stim. You have this entrainment over a wide range of stimulation amplitudes. Now, you need some level of stim, right? If you go to stim 0, it's no longer entrained. But between a low therapeutic level of, say, 1.5, 2 milliamps, and a high therapeutic level of, say, 3.5 milliamps, in many persons, there is still this entrained gamma activity if you are in an on-medication state. So you can use it to say when you don't need as much stim, or when the entrained gamma activity is a marker for needing more stimulation. So our adaptive stim paradigm that is just coming out is as several people have pointed out, Gerd Tinghauser and Julian and others have pointed out, the importance of time scale in adaptive stim. There's all sorts of different time scales. The original Simon Little paper in Annals of Neurology that generated so much excitement was very fast adaptive stim, right? They gave, in Peter Brown's lab, gave very brief pulses from going from 0 milliamps to a brief pulse of stim that shortened beta bursts. That operated on a sub-second time scale.
Yeah.
Which is very hard to implement in existing fully implanted devices. Not totally sure it's possible, but it's at least hard. Okay. So we started working more on a slower time course of adaptive stim, where instead of trimming beta bursts, you use signals reflective of the medication on and off states to adjust stim over sort of a minutes to hours time scale. And that's the paradigm where this entrained gamma activity becomes very useful. For very fast adaptive stim, like in the original Simon Little, Peter Brown paper, it may well be that beta is a great signal. So you have to consider the time scale with adaptive.
Yeah. Really cool. And then if you look at these, like the entrainment itself, it even looks like before you switch on DBS, there's finely tuned gamma maybe already present, but then it shifts really at frequency. You'd sometimes even see it smearing down. This was probably an image Andrea showed, but you probably saw similar things in your data.
Yes.
How do you think that works? Is it just this, tipping it at the right phase, and then it entrains it, or how do you conceptualize that?
Well, we again were lucky to pair up with some computational modeling folks at Oxford. And one of the grad students there, J.J. Sermon, did some modeling with his mentors. He had multiple mentors in the computational lab there, and used a little bit of our experimental work as well on entrained gamma. And I really, their framework, principle in physics of coupled oscillators, right? Think of two pendulums that are linked by a little mechanical linkage that you see in your first year college physics class. And so the brain is one oscillator, and it has natural frequencies like a spring, right? Theta would be one natural frequency. But in at least a Parkinsonian brain that's seen levodopa, there's a gamma frequency between 60 and 90 that is a natural frequency. And so that's the driven oscillator is the brain with its natural frequencies. And the driving oscillator is DBS, right? Which so far has been given as a constant frequency signal. And so that will entrain, if there is a natural frequency near one of the subharmonics of the driving frequency, you will, by the basic principle of coupled oscillators, be able to entrain the brain to a subharmonic. It's usually half stim frequency, and this may be a clue. Why is it that 130, 140, 150 hertz seem to be the frequencies that we use so often in DBS? Well, the half harmonic of that are in this prokinetic gamma range, and maybe that's a clue to why those frequencies work. That's just pure speculation on my part.
Did you try half frequency stim?
So both Maria Olero in the lab and Maria Sherbakova, who's actually our computer scientist in the lab, have been doing these stim titration curves, and they presented at some meetings, but it's not fully published yet. Where they look at a patient. This is not at home now, but in clinic. We bring the patient in clinic, and we titrate through a whole set of combinations of amplitude and frequency and look at cortical and subcortical recording and ask, where does entrainment occur? Where does it occur at the lowest amplitude? So often the lowest amplitude that causes entrainment of gamma activity is near the stim frequency, near 130, 140 hertz. But you can, Maria Sherbakova actually showed, and she's starting to present this work, with 60 hertz and 50 hertz stim, you can entrain the high beta range. You can entrain 25 and 30 hertz rhythms.
Interesting.
It takes a little bit more. And I think of some of the early work by Peter Brown and others where they tried to do 20 hertz stim and show that you can induce bradykinesia. And I feel like actually you should do those studies with 45, 50 hertz stim, because you entrain most efficiently at a subharmonic of stim. And not only maybe does it entrain more efficiently, but you can actually see what you're doing, right? Because when you look at something at stim frequency, you have a serious problem of stim artifact. Whereas when you go to a subharmonic, you have much less of that problem. So much to do, to induce bradykinesia, essentially, right? That's the idea. It would be the idea to test that. That would be the idea. Yeah.
And so you talked about the artifact issue, and I think when I saw you present this first time, you were probably much more cautious to convince people that this is not an artifact, because you had to convince yourselves. I think by now the field has accepted it, so we don't talk about it much more. But it feels like that must have been an important thing to convince yourselves this is not, just the stimulation artifact. And maybe that might even have been the reason why it had been discovered so late in the game. Could both be true? Can you talk about that?
Absolutely. In fact, interesting story. We've seen entrained gamma early on that we really thought was artifactual. So when we were looking in the early Activa PC plus S device, which tend to have a lot more artifacts going for it than later generations. Roe Gilrow in a postdoc in my lab kind of took over from Nikki Swan when she left to go to University of Oregon as a professor. And I remember looking with him at some of the recordings on STEM, and we found, for example, a patient who had a huge 40 hertz sharp peak in the power spectrum, and thought, well, that's on STEM. That's obviously an artifact, right? It just looked like it. So then years later, I had the opportunity to record the same thing in the patient after he'd been switched to a Percept pulse generator. And you could, just for out of interest's sake, I looked at it as you had STEM on, then you turned STEM off. And that huge 40 hertz artifact took 2 minutes to wash out after STEM was fully off, and realized that it was actually 1 to 4 entrainment. He was at 160 hertz. So it was 1 to 4 entrained activity. And people still debate about this. It's not a closed debate about the artifactual nature, because you can get subharmonic pure electrical artifacts, right? Those happen a lot. So how do you distinguish the two of them? And certainly needing a washout time after turning off STEM suggests physiological origin. Sensitivity to medication state of the brain, levodopa, and to sleep affects entrained rhythms a lot. So sensitivity to physiological state of the brain would suggest that it's physiological, not artifactual. The fact that these entrained phenomenon are often more pronounced at a distant site from the stimulation locus, right? Bigger in the cortex than right adjacent in the subthalamic nucleus also suggests a physiological pathway. So not all subharmonic activity is physiological, but it's very useful to ask the question. And does that also make it harder to use as a biomarker, because it might be artifact sometimes? Yeah, it can be. It can be. And we have cases, particularly in the basal ganglia nuclei, where you're recording right next to the stimulator, where we see subharmonic peaks in the power spectrum, and it looks more artifactual. One sign of it being artifactual is if there's no variance. So when you have a physiological entrained gamma rhythm, movement causes it to have variance. Arousal state causes it to have variance. So if you're looking at one of these subharmonic artifacts over time and it just doesn't change, there's minimal variance, that's a sign that it actually is an electrical artifact.
Got it. And then last question on the gamma. So we had three gamma rhythms that we talked about already. One is the new finely tuned gamma. And then I understood that what you showed with Coralie de Hemtien, that was broadband gamma entrainment, not entrainment, but coupling with the beta rhythm. So that's different. But then the third one was really the pallidotomy induced unleashed gamma, and that was not broadband, right?
That was narrowband. No, that was narrowband gamma, and it actually is, I think, the same as levodopa-induced 60 to 90 hertz narrowband gamma. I think it's like getting a burst of levodopa in the operating room when you lesion the pallidum, correlating with the little burst of dyskinesia, and then presumably after pallidotomy, maybe it settles down to a prokinetic but not dyskinetic rhythm in the brain. We don't know because we can't record long term there. I will say that that's not the only story about gamma rhythms. There's one of my postdocs who's just finished her postdoc but hasn't published all the works yet. Stephanie Cernera has done some great chronic recording in patients with isolated dystonia, and they also have cortical gamma rhythms. They're a little different. They tend not to be the classic 60 to 90 hertz narrowband gamma or finely tuned gamma, but more 50 to 60 hertz. But they can also be entrained by DBS. So entrainment is a ubiquitous phenomenon. It's not specific to Parkinson's. And they are also, I think, predominant in S1, right, in sensory cortex. So yeah, good pickup, because we really have published very little about this, but it's been presented at some meetings. Stephanie Cernera has presented that. So yeah, in the isolated dystonia case, again, these are isolated dystonia, not Parkinson's patients who have dystonia, but isolated dystonia. The naturally occurring, if you will, narrowband gamma tends to be localized more to post-central gyrus, whereas in Parkinson's, levodopa-induced gamma is more localized to pre-central gyrus, and Nikki had shown that a long time ago. And then the entrainment of that dystonia
gamma. Is that GPI DBS or STN DBS or both?
So you can do it with both. The person that Stephanie studied the most with thousands of hours of recording was a palatal stem in severe cervical dystonia patients. She's working on writing up those results.
Very cool. There's so much to learn here. So fantastic work, and so many open questions, but also so much progress already. Really fantastic. So devices such as the Activa PC plus S, Summit RC plus S, and now the Percept have allowed chronic LFP recordings at home, and they have been, I think, led to a shift in your lab, but also has spawned many other people to go into this. How do these technology advances shape your work, and what would be maybe needed for the next steps? What hardware-wise, what would you need to?
Yeah. Well, we had done between 2008 when we started doing intraoperative Ecog, and really focused on that until around 2014 or so. And then gradually shifted because we had so many questions that couldn't be answered with intraoperative recording. And when these tools became available, PC plus S, then Summit RC plus S, and now Percept, that just made us, switch at least for a while to the chronic recording, because these are pretty amazing tools, right? To be able to do long-term recording at home in patients' completely naturalistic environments with invasive recording levels of signal quality. That's a new world. And so that was very compelling and fascinating to us. What we need, I'm grateful to companies like Medtronic for having introduced this and putting resources into purely investigational devices, right? I'm grateful to them for their vision in this. On the other hand, we do need better chronic recording devices. We need a Percept-like device that will do time series recording at home over long times. We need the one huge missing piece from the current ecosystem of brain stimulators is cortical electrodes designed for cortical recording don't exist anymore, except for in FDA approved examples, except for the NeuroPace device has a cortical paddle. But we need much better ones. We need much higher channel count. We need much more flexible ones that you can kind of steer around corners like we can do with temporary Ecog strips, but the permanent ones are too stiff. Seems so simple, right? Just there's no new technology needs to be invented, but we do not have enough. We have almost no options in cortical leads, and we have to improvise.
You recorded local field potentials of a patient while skiing. How did that work, and what did you find?
That was another fun project. It originally, Roey Gilrone, when he was a postdoc, and I went skiing with this patient. He's one of our Summit RC plus S patients who happened to work as a professional ski repair person and had access to all sorts of ski areas and was well known. And he was, of course, an expert skier who had Parkinson's and could ski both on and off meds, had a lot of leg dystonias and difficulties, but still could ski on and off. So this was at the beginning, in the early time of the pandemic in 2020. Roey and I met him up at a ski area up at Lake Tahoe, and this was more of a just for fun kind of thing, because we can, not so much hypothesis-driven work really, but Roey wired him up with EMG, wireless EMG with the DELSA system, and of course we set his RC plus S to record, transmit to a small computer. He wore the computer in a little backpack. We skied, one of us skied behind him, one of us carrying the DELSys receiver, and one using the GoPro to film. And at the top of each run, we would do a procedure to synchronize the video and external system with the internal system, basically by delivering a synchronization pulse to each. So a person who, a neurosurgeon who came to work with me for a year and a half, Rodrigo Fernandez, actually took up the mantle of that and is processing those data. And I think we're getting close to submitting that little case report about skiing. But again, it's a fun way to show you can now record invasive brain activity in patients doing outdoor sports.
Yeah, super cool. The Open Mind Consortium, what is it and how important are collaborations in the field?
Yeah, thank you for asking. So Open Mind Group is a group of investigators that began around the challenges of implementing that Medtronic investigational device Summit RC+S, but has expanded, I hope, and think well beyond that particular device. So as we go into this ecosystem of chronic brain recording devices, there's a lot of common infrastructure that labs need to have, and it doesn't make sense for them to invent it themselves. And one is just the regulatory documents. In the US, it's the FDA investigational device exemption. Why should everyone start from scratch doing their own and guessing what is going to be accepted or not? So that's one thing that the Open Mind exists to pool, are regulatory documents. Another thing is with that first device, well, the second generation Medtronic device, RC+S, they did a very novel thing. Medtronic did is they opened up the application programming interface to investigators to use. And that means that investigators can write the software to run the device. It's like writing the programming tablet for a DBS device as an investigator. Huge opportunity to customize the device, but a huge new challenge. We don't write medical device software in academics. We don't know the FDA regulations around writing medical device software. So a big impetus behind Open Mind initially, this was around 2018 as groups were getting going with RC+S, was to share software to run the device, share the regulatory documents, share templates, so-called quality management systems for being able to correctly document medical device software. So when we were getting started our own RC+S work, Greg Worrell's group at Mayo, who is using the device in epilepsy studies, helped us, shared some software infrastructure. Dave Borton's group at Brown did so, and Tim Dennison's group at Oxford did so, and we all got together to create this consortium and of investigators to share technical infrastructure, software, and especially regulatory documents like investigational device exemptions. And then subsequently, another member joined us, Jeff Herron, who's a professor of engineering in the neurosurgery department at University of Washington, was a designer of Summit RC+S, really joined our group as a super active member. And then the Open Mind Group has been helping other groups outside of this core 5 groups to develop their programs and bidirectional interfaces, not by sharing data or pooling data, but simply by sharing the infrastructure needed to get your research going. FDA investigation device exemption protocols, software infrastructure, sort of best practices for even bench testing of devices, and issues related to how to document your medical software. And it was spontaneous. It helped us all. And then we were able to get funding from NIH through the NIH actually has grants for technology dissemination. And so it funded us starting in 2020 for what we were already doing. And then we have worked to provide any of this infrastructure to other groups that might be using bidirectional interfaces. I think we've been really trying to expand it beyond the original motivator, the Summit RC+S, to include use of other devices, non-Medtronic devices, working with Neuronica to bring some of these concepts to them, to help the community with common data analysis platforms, for example. And of course, we're not the only one. You have, the University of Florida group developed Bravo, a beautiful system for visualizing and storing percept data. The Berlin group, of course, has systems for doing this. So a wonderful thing about our field, isn't it, that it is very collaborative, and people develop tools that they want others to use. You've done an enormous amount of work with that with Lead DBS and other work. And that's a beautiful thing about our field that I think we all love about it. And so Open Mind is one piece of that.
Super cool. Really love it. I have one more guest question from Julian Neumann that's, not so much about science. And he says an exceptionally high number of postdocs from your lab have made the jump to professorship with an excellent gender ratio. You're setting an example with that. And apart from being blessed with incredibly intelligent mentees such as Coralie de Hemteen, Nicole Swan, Svetlana Miocinovich, and more, can you share any tips for making sure your postdocs get the chance they deserve?
Yeah, it's really a sweet question. Thank you, Julian, for that. I will just mention a few more that are up and coming. You've heard some of them. Carina Oehrn, originally from Germany. She's finishing her postdoc, has several nice job offers. Not sure where she's going to end up. Stephanie Cernera just took a position at I think it's Synchron, the people who do the Stentrode, as a clinical director.
Great.
Lauren Hammer just got an assistant professorship at University of Pennsylvania. She's worked with us, so quite a few. As you mentioned, Roe Gilroan is the chief scientist at Rune Technologies. So.
And Doris
Doris is now our faculty member with us, and there's many more. And I'm sorry to any that I've left out, but. It's a great part of our work, isn't it? Having these trainees. I've been lucky to have this great group of people. I don't know, and also lucky that it's been, a great gender balance, as you'd say. Actually, I probably train more women as postdocs. More for our clinical fellowship, it's more male. But overall, really good gender balance, which is great. I think I've been lucky. You'd have to ask the trainees if there's some formula behind it. I will say that I think one thing that I do well in the lab is know when to provide help and know when to get out of their way. I think that's a skill. What do you think about that? You're now mentoring a bunch of people.
I'm just beginning. I shouldn't give advice or I'm trying my best, of course, but no, I mean also on the clinical side, you've trained Mark Richardson and John Ralston, who are the two surgeons here that I work with. Both couldn't speak higher about you, and many others. I think Dario Englot and lots of people that are now the key players in the field. So there must be something you do right, but.
I have to give a lot of credit to the training environment at UCSF, and so some of these folks have done a formal fellowship with us that I direct, and a number that you mentioned have not done the fellowship, but have actually been residents at UCSF. Dario, John, Mark Richardson have gone out to have great careers, and I can take a little bit of credit for that, but UCSF has really created a pretty amazing environment for training people and emphasizing excellence in scientific inquiry. Mitch Berger, the person who hired me, really developed that culture at UCSF, and I have to really thank him for that. And then, of course, recently Eddie Chang took over as our chair after a long period of Mitch, and is going to the next level with creating an environment that emphasizes excellence. And so, there's a lot of people to take credit for the training environment at UCSF.
Fantastic. And since we talked about, so you mentioned Roy Gilron, who now is, I think, lead scientist or something similar at Rune Labs, and apparently somebody went to Synchron as well. How do you think about, is it part of our role to also make, prepare people for careers in the industry, and how do you deal with that?
It absolutely is part of our role to train people, and I don't really make a distinction with grad students coming in or postdocs. Well, where are you going? Are you planning on academics or industry? I don't make that distinction, and I think that distinction is becoming less important. My hope is that we're going to see in the future even more fluidity between careers in industry and academics. We've seen really nice examples of people going from industry back into academics. Tim Dennison, Jeff Herron at University of Washington, great examples. And I would like to see more of that. So, I think both of these are very important, and the barriers between them are getting less.
It's a great concept to reduce the barriers there. I totally agree. I think the field has already profited so much from Tim getting back to Oxford as one example, and have been meaning to get him on the show too for a while. And there's hopes. I think it might happen. So. All right. So to wrap up, I want to be mindful of your time. Some more rapid fire or general questions. Feel free to answer as long or short as you want. I do always ask about eureka moments. You already mentioned the one with the finely tuned gamma, but do you have other examples of things that you really loved?
I think something that helped us get on to the cross-frequency interaction story, and Kai Miller actually helped me early in my career. Kai is now at Mayo Clinic. And he helped us a little bit just with some software and analysis methods. And when we started looking at cortical activity, time averaged around subthalamic single units. We could see not only were subthalamic single unit firing, not only were they synchronized to the phase of the beta rhythm, but they were also synchronized to these big waves of broadband gamma in a spike time spectrogram of cortical activity. That's a paper that my then lab assistant Sho Shimamoto published in Journal of Neuroscience. And that was, I thank Kai for kind of getting us started on that. And it turned out the very first one we analyzed was the most dramatic, right, to point the way to this. So that was a really nice moment. Another thing I mentioned before, but I'll say it again, it's not a eureka moment, but a slow, very important realization in the field is the importance of reassessing physiomarkers, neural signatures that you understood before stimulation, reassessing those comprehensively after starting stimulation. Yeah. That's not a eureka moment, but a slow and sometimes painful realization.
Yeah. Did you ever think this was a big waste of my time?
Nothing really. I mean, Nikki, when she was in the lab, Nikki Swan brought EEG. She was an expert at EEG, and that was great. I tried to continue to do some studies with EEG after Nikki left, and it's just not my forte. Likewise, I've done some work in the distant past with non-human primates, not my forte. So I think for me, doing what I do best, which is human invasive brain recording, has been the most productive thing.
Fantastic. Any advice for young researchers entering either neurosurgery or neuroscience in academia? My main one is sort of don't worry, be happy. I don't know if you've noticed this, Andy, but sometimes at our meetings at the think tank, there's been lately a bit of negativity in some of the device industry world. There's been a bit of negativity about the fact that, we're not growing really as much as expected. We can't do a lot of the things in industry we thought we were going to do. There's been a little negativity recently over a decline in funding for the Brain Initiative, which may only be temporary, right? It may just be a brief one-year thing. We're not sure. But, I think my advice to people is this is a wonderful field, this field of neuromodulation in particular. The fundamentals are incredibly strong, right? The fundamentals of the new tools, the new science, the great people in it, the great interest of federal funders. Prior to the Brain Initiative, it was very hard to get funding for invasive brain studies and for devices. And the Brain Initiative changed that enormously, and it's not going to go away. It's going to have blips up and down with funding, but it's not going to go away. So the fundamentals are fantastic. It is a great time to be getting into the field of neuromodulation. It's better than ever. So that's my advice. How do you see the future of the field as a whole, say in 5 or 10 years?
Yeah, I mean, similar. I think it's fantastic what is going on and what will be going on. I hope that we get even more flexible and high channel count and high sampling rate chronic brain recording devices. That's going to be huge. You and others, of course, have shown the power of different imaging approaches. The connectomic approach has been so productive. before, you had asked me, about intraoperatively, what are the big trends? I think the introduction of imaging into the operating room, and I don't just mean interventional MRI, I mean using, for example, cone beam CT in the regular OR to localize electrodes, has been a huge boon, and that's going to just continue.
So I actually just realized I skipped that question unintentionally. The future operation room, how does it look like? And maybe attached to that, do you see your OR as a lab?
Yeah, of course. We, certainly many of us in my department and now functional neurosurgeons around the country and world see the OR as a laboratory. We do have to be very careful as we do that, and I think the field is being careful about the ethics of this, about appropriately consenting patients. We all are trying to do what's sometimes called opportunistic research with patients who already require a surgical procedure, whether it's in the OR or later. And this is great. We have a wonderful patient community that wants to contribute. We do have to be, always be vigilant about both consent issues and doing research studies really safely. And we also, I will say that one thing that I know I've done, John Ralston, Mark Richardson, a lot of us who do all of this kind of intraoperative work, we are very quick to abandon something that is research-oriented if it's not going well for the patient, right?
Yeah.
When we put in an Ecog strip, I sort of have a rule. It doesn't go super easy that first pass, you're done, right? If a patient just shows that they're not really appropriate for this in some way, you're done. So we have to have a very low threshold to refocus just on the clinical care of the person, and I think most people are doing that. So that's very important.
Is there anything we should be doing as a field that we are not? So a missed opportunity that we should focus more on?
I thought about that a little bit, and I can't think of too much other than, of course, the slightly slower than could be opportunity of chronic brain recording. But that's just a blip, that it's a little bit slower now. I can't think. I'm sure that you and others can think of things, but I'm really quite happy with how things are going.
Yeah, and I share that. To be honest, I'm an optimist, so I typically don't see the hair in the soup as much either. So I wouldn't really know what we should be doing differently either. But I think it's still a good question sometimes, because some people come up with cool ideas. So, but I would agree with you. I think we're kind of on track as a field, and that's great. So last question, anything you would have wanted to talk about more that I skipped or missed? Or
I do want to mention, of all the people I've talked about, influenced me and wonderful trainees and colleagues, I do want to mention one of my great benefactors in my career, a woman named Dolores Cakebread. So my official title at UCSF is Dolores Cakebread Professor of Neurological Surgery. And Dolores, who passed away a few years ago, was a really wonderful woman who was one of my patients and gave me an endowed chair in 2006. Her family still runs Cakebread Cellars, a wonderful winery in Napa. And so I want to encourage anyone who comes out to visit California, is going to wine country, make an appointment at Cakebread Cellars. For some reason, they like to have people make appointments rather than drop in. And they have really wonderful sort of medium high-end wines.
Great.
And they've been a great benefactor. And it also illustrates, philanthropy is so important in our work, right? Not everything can be funded. So having the philanthropic input is critical, and there's a way to cultivate it. In the case of Dolores, just out of nowhere, she sort of gave me this endowed chair. But in other cases, we cultivate philanthropy, and there's a way to do it that minimizes conflict of interest, and it's really important. I'm grateful to Dolores, and please enjoy Cakebread Cellars.
Thank you. Fantastic. Thank you so much one more time, Philip, for joining. It was a big honor to talk to you.
Thanks very much, Andy. This was great. Really enjoyed it.